Once again, welcome everybody. When Daniel Andrews took on the leadership of his party, the job every politician worth their salt covets, it was in circumstances that every aspiring Premier or Prime Minister likes least. Victorian Labor had lost what many inside and outside their ranks thought was a relatively safe election, and Labor was out of power after a decade of rule. The loss presaged a further souring of Labor's fortunes across the length and breadth of the land. Daniel Andrews became leader of the opposition with the certainty of 4 years in the state political wilderness and the likelihood of 8. Ted Baillieu might have scored a narrow, very narrow win, but he was popular and looked like a stayer. What a difference 2 years can make. Labor might be holding on to power by a thread in Canberra. It might be gone in the West, in New South Wales, in the Northern Territory, and it might have vanished, leaving barely a trace in Queensland. But in Victoria, there is more than a glimmer of hope for their true believers. A by-election in July appears to have tested the boundaries of Melbourne's Green Revolution and given Labor and its leader an energising victory. And the mounting problems of the Baillieu Government have seen a slump in its support. A news poll in late August showed the Coalition and Labor tied 50-50 on a two-party preferred basis, and Ted Baillieu's dissatisfaction rating jumping 21 points to 50%. While it is, of course, way too early to predict the fortunes of either side of politics 2 years out from the next election, it is now more than idle speculation to consider what change a new Labor government might bring and what kind of Premier Daniel Andrews might make. Today we are promised more than a taste on both counts. Daniel Andrews might not yet be a household name in Victoria, but he has a significant pedigree and his profile is building. After growing up in Wangaratta and studying at Monash University, he worked with the state branch of the ALP as Assistant Secretary and Deputy Campaign Director. He first entered Parliament in 2002 as the MLA for Mulgrave, becoming Minister for Gaming, Minister for Consumer Affairs and Minister assisting the Premier on Multicultural Affairs in 2006. The following year he became Minister for Health, a post he held until the 2010 election defeat. One of his numerous distinctions in that role is that, to the best of our knowledge, neither he nor any prominent family members felt compelled to give the bird to a gathering of pesky hospital protesters. Before we begin, I would like to make an important clarification. The Melbourne Press Club is an equal opportunity soapbox. We are delighted to have the Leader of the Opposition with us today, but we would also be very happy to host the Premier again, if we could ever persuade his staff to answer their emails. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Daniel Andrews.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Can I, of course, begin my remarks this afternoon by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. To Mark Baker, and thank you for those very kind words. I'm not sure if I need to add to those, but I think I will. To the many other distinguished guests that are here, of course, my parliamentary, both shadow cabinet and also caucus colleagues. At breakfast this morning, my 3 children were kind of interrogating me about when I'd be home tonight. And I said, look, I'll be home for dinner. I promise I'll be home for dinner. And they've heard this before, of course, and they then sought to kind of interrogate me a bit more and said, well, OK, run us through your day. And I said, I've got a meeting with an important delegation of Chinese leaders in the morning. I've got a couple of other meetings. Then I'm going to the Melbourne Press Club for lunch. And the 3 of them sort of looked at me, and this is 10, 8 and 5, and they said, well, what sort of a club is that? And I said, well, it's a club with lots and lots of journalists in it. And the 3 of them, I kid you not, like 3 meerkats, looked up at me, and the look of terror in their eyes was quite amazing. I reassured them that I was amongst friends and that today was a great opportunity, and I'm glad to hear that it is indeed an equal opportunity soapbox. I'm certainly glad to be here with you today. As we approach the halfway mark of the Baillieu Government's term in office, I want to give you some thoughts on their achievements and, more importantly, detail some of my priorities for the next 2 years and beyond. Today's not about launching a manifesto or a fight-back type document. Rather, it's a chance for me to give you a clear sense of the things that I think are important. When it comes to political leaders and their parties, the Victorian community can give no greater gift, bestow no greater honour and entrust no greater responsibility than the right to govern. It's an extraordinary thing, really, the right and the responsibility to lead the state and the obligation to work hard to make Victoria a stronger and a fairer place. If, like me, you have faith and belief in the power of government to empower people and communities to drive opportunity and the realisation of potential, then winning government is everything. That's why it's so disappointing that despite winning office and achieving a majority in both houses, something Labor enjoyed for just 4 of our 11 years, Mr Baillieu and his team have so little to show for nearly 2 years in power. I think there's a growing dissatisfaction with the Premier and his performance. Published polls certainly point to it. But it's as much, ladies and gentlemen, about feel as it is about numbers. Victoria was a leader in Australia, exerting an influence economically and in policy terms that confounded the apparent strength of other resource-rich states. There was, for a time, a very strong momentum, a tangible energy and vitality in ideas, investment and innovation surrounding our state. Sadly, I think much of that momentum has gone. It survived the global financial crisis, it endured prolonged drought and natural disasters, but it has succumbed to the inertia and indifference of this government. So, as Mark has alluded to, the parliament is tight, the contest is tight. It's therefore not unreasonable to ask what are my priorities. I want to give you 5 key priorities today. All are important to me and all will be a focus of my team over the next 2 years. First and foremost, jobs. Employment gives purpose, opportunity, meaning and dignity. Nothing is more important to Victorians and nothing is more important to me. Under Labor, Victoria was the engine room of Australian employment. In 2009, some 92% of all new full-time jobs were created right here in Victoria. Across our term of office, 683,000 jobs were created, 100,000 of them in 2010 alone. Things are a little different today. The term crisis is often used, but regardless of the descriptor, we've lost 11,500 full-time jobs over the last 2 years. The participation rate is down and key indicators like youth unemployment have never been worse, some 18.3% last month. We've gone from leading the nation to being pushed right back in the pack, and I think that we can and indeed we must do better than that. That's why my team have been working hard to develop a jobs plan, touring the state, listening to business, listening to industry associations, to unions and, of course, to ordinary, hard-working Victorians. We'll be making announcements about the first part of our plan for jobs and investment later this year, but today I want to make it very clear to you that jobs growth, that job creation, is a priority for me. I also want to make it clear to you that I'm not for a moment blaming Mr Baillieu for the high Australian dollar that's burning a hole in the competitiveness of our manufacturers, and I'm not blaming Mr Baillieu for Eurozone financial uncertainty or the sluggish demand in the retail and property sectors. I'm also not saying that a state government can necessarily fix each and every one of these problems, but I am saying I've never seen anyone solve or properly respond to a problem that they didn't acknowledge. If you refuse to accept that industry, communities and indeed households right across Victoria face real pressures and challenges, then I think you're unlikely, indeed you are unable, to assist them. Next, a steady and regular flow of infrastructure investment. I've attended quite a few openings in the last 2 years, openings of projects commissioned by Labor in government. The point is this: soon Mr Baillieu will run out of Labor ribbons to cut. He'll have to come up with a major projects agenda of his own. And ladies and gentlemen, don't be fooled. Simply evaluating tenders for the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre or adding a floor to the Box Hill or Bendigo hospitals or merely proceeding with the regional rail link does not amount to a fresh infrastructure agenda. One infrastructure project that has been topical is the proposed east-west link. Mr Baillieu thinks the business case is strongest for the eastern section of this road. I think a second river crossing, an important redundancy for the Westgate Bridge, and a link direct into the port is a stronger project. Stronger when you consider the productivity benefits, and stronger when you acknowledge that funds are, of course, limited. The price tag for this entire project is astronomical, estimated to be between some $12 and $15 billion. A backup for the Westgate, which currently handles more than 165,000 vehicles a day, as well as the significant commercial and residential growth in the west, make this a compelling case. West-east is the way we should view this project. If congestion at Hoddle Street is a priority, then the question is, why has the government scrapped the Hoddle Street study? It was very important when you consider that around 2/3 of traffic coming off the Eastern Freeway travel into or south of the city, not across the city. This is an interesting debate for many reasons. For instance, months after first talking about the project and boldly committing some $15 million for soil testing and, wait for it, geotechnical works, terms designed to inspire confidence and the perception of action, the Premier is still unable to answer even the most basic questions about this project. When will it start? When will it finish? What route will it take? How much will it cost? Who will pay for it? How many cars and trucks will use this road each day? These are simple and basic questions. A few $1 million and a post hole digger parked down on Alexandra Parade do not pass for an infrastructure plan. Not now, not ever. So the question may well be, why is there no major projects or infrastructure agenda under this government? Well, it's clear to me that on infrastructure, this government is not so much being run by Ted Baillieu, it's instead being run by the Department of Treasury and Finance. I don't want to offend the good people who work there, but make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, Treasury have never seen a spending proposal they liked or a revenue generator they didn't. Despite the fact that advice to ministers from Treasury is written on green paper, it is almost always a red light to new spending. To be fair, that is of course their job. It's also the job of any good government to balance that conservatism with the need to actually govern. Lethargy and indecision is not leadership. Hiding under your desk is just hiding under your desk. Starving the constructors of this state of a pipeline of infrastructure is bad for our economy, bad for confidence, bad for jobs, and bad for skills. It's also ultimately bad for value. Every one of the projects we need escalates in price every month the government delays. A return to consistent infrastructure spending with long-term certainty and independent analysis is a priority for me, and I'll have more to say about this quite soon. Thirdly, improving, and I emphasise that word, improving services. State politics is not quite roads, rates and rubbish, as local government is sometimes unkindly described, but it's principally about delivering services. Despite the glib promise to fix the problems, we've seen little improvement and instead significant decline. Just look at our health system. A veteran bureaucrat once described health policy to me as essentially like juggling three balls: the budget bottom line, the elective surgery waiting list, and emergency department performance. Well, far from juggling these three, the Premier has dropped each. 56 of the 81 health services that have tabled annual reports in the Parliament this year have reported deficits. We're performing less elective surgery than under Labor, with waiting lists nudging at least 45 or 46,000 and heading towards 50,000 Victorians, and our emergency departments are, on many occasions, like an episode of MASH. doctors, nurses and paramedics are all saying budget cuts and inadequate funding are placing the system and, most importantly, patient care under enormous and unprecedented pressure. I can tell you what's happening in the Health Department right now. Senior officials are begging David Davis to get more money out of Ted Baillieu, more money to make sure patients get the care and support that they need. My priority is to deliver policy that will improve services and be honest with the people who use them. To do anything less is to fail the key responsibility of any state government. And worse still, it's to take Victorians for fools. I'm not interested in cheap jack claims about fixing everything. Instead, I intend to do the hard work to better understand the challenges we face and then develop the plans essential for improvement. Fourthly, investing in skills for industry and for individuals. Vocational education and training is essential to growth and prosperity. Helping Victorians secure the skills they need to in turn secure the job they want is important. Not everyone has the opportunity or the inclination to attend university. What's more, that pathway alone will not meet the needs of industry or indeed consumers. That's why it's so disappointing that the government has cut so deeply into TAFE. These cuts mean around 2,000 staff will be out of work. Many courses are gone, fees have been massively increased, campuses are closing and so too, sadly, are pathways. These cuts will disenfranchise thousands of students, young and old. They will now be prohibited by cost or geography from obtaining the skills that they want, the skills our economy needs. The Australian Industry Group was right when they noted that the reduction in money for programs will have an impact on uptake and quality. Consider, for example, the students of outer eastern Melbourne. The Swinburne Lilydale campus will shut its doors. A student from Yea will now have to complete their Swinburne studies as far away as Hawthorn. Swinburne Croydon, at the gateway to the Yarra Valley, has cut its winemaking classes. It just makes no sense. I was recently out at Lilydale meeting with students and staff. One young student approached me and made a simple but I think profound point. She said to me, "All I want is a future." Cutting TAFE is wrong, especially when nearly 1 in 5 young people who want a job can't find one, and when many sectors across our economy are crying out for more skilled staff. That's why skills attainment is a priority for me. Labor will continue to assess the impact of these cuts, the full extent of which will not be apparent until the beginning of the 2013 academic year. Fifthly, fighting for fairness. I believe that we cannot be a stronger Victoria unless we are a fairer Victoria. Fighting for fairness takes many different forms. It can be voting against regressive changes to equal opportunity laws. It can be making sure a person's postcode doesn't make it harder for them to survive their cancer. It can be investing work cover surpluses in safer workplaces instead of plundering the scheme. Or it can be supporting families who face very tough challenges each and every day. For instance, families with children who have a special educational need. If I can give you some facts. It's estimated that between 5 and 10% of the population is dyslexic. Autism spectrum disorder cases grew over 30% between 2008 and 2010. 10% of children are considered to be developmentally vulnerable, yet there exists no compulsory module on special needs education in basic teacher training in Victoria. Recently, I met with a mother and her son. He has dyspraxia, a neurological condition that affects speech, fine and gross motor skills, or movement and coordination. Dyspraxia also affects memory and, of course, confidence. It's frustrating and it's debilitating for the child and especially for those who love them. We spoke for an hour or so about the challenges her son and their family face every day. It was very moving. Perhaps I had a soft spot for him. Like my youngest, his name is Joseph. As our conversation and appeal for help essentially continued, it became clear to me that our education system is not simply failing to adequately support Joseph, his parents and siblings, but in many ways the system makes dealing with dyspraxia even harder. In recent months, I've held a number of forums and meetings about better support for children with special needs. I want to develop a realistic policy that will improve the support that they can expect. Of course, I need to better understand the issues involved for kids like Joseph, and I intend to. We can do more and we can do better for the estimated 1 in 5 families just like his. It's all about fairness. It's one example that's all about fairness, and that's why it's a priority for me. To conclude, if you want to make Victoria a fairer and a stronger place, I think it's essential to have a plan. I think it's essential to have a strategy. But ladies and gentlemen, most importantly, I think it's essential to have a go. That's what's most important. It's just not good enough to simply occupy the office. You have to use it to drive change, to drive reform, to drive opportunity. Jobs, infrastructure, improved services with honesty, skills attainment and a fight for fairness, these are my priorities. Why? Why are these my priorities? Because my parents taught me, and I'm teaching my kids, that the decisions governments make really do matter. That without support, many in our community never, ever get the life opportunities that they're entitled to. That when governments fail to invest and, worse still, take away, we all pay a price. Ladies and gentlemen, I would not cut EMA or reading recovery or make it harder for young Victorians to get skills. I would not ignore unemployment or dither while the challenges mounted. I would not ask a parent to choose between buying food and paying for their child's VCAL fees. I would not cut hundreds of millions of dollars out of our hospital system and then pretend that it didn't affect patients. That's not the sort of Premier I want to be. Over the next 2 years, I'm determined to give Victorians a real choice, to do the hard work, to listen, to develop the plans and the policies that make us a stronger and a fairer state. Ladies and gentlemen, politics is not a hobby for me. It's what I do. It's what I've done my whole working life. And that's why I'm determined to give Mr Baillieu a red-hot run for his money, not merely to defeat him, but to win that precious right to govern. Thank you for your kind invitation to address you today.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It's going to be the longest election campaign in history, I think. I think we have 2 microphones. Our custom is that we take questions in the beginning from working journalists. So,
Mark assured me that we could take questions, but answers were optional. I don't know about that.
I'm not sure
John
we're
Ferguson.
actually working at the moment, but
What a great place to start,
John
John.
Ferguson from The Australian. 20 pages, it's the vision thing, but you made no mention of population growth, which is probably the central issue facing infrastructure provision.
Yep.
Do you think we're full up? And if not, how are you actually going to provide for that enormous growth in the western suburbs and the northwest, which is basically going to be the new political ground over the next 20 years?
John, I don't think we're full up. I think that we over time, I think we could all reflect and say we could better manage the growth we've had and the growth that we will have. The key point is that we've had a holiday from managing that growth. Now, some may criticise us for not managing it well enough. We've had a holiday as a state and an economy for the last 2 years from managing that growth. There's been very little, if any, investment, very little, if any, energy, very little, if any, passion to say, look, growth is a good thing. I remember the 1990s, I was, as we all were, doing different things, but I remember the 1990s when people couldn't get out of this community fast enough. We don't want to go back to that. Growth is about prosperity. Prosperity is about generating the income and the surpluses we as a community and an economy need to build the infrastructure that we all are crying out for. Now, at the beginning I was clear, and many in the room will get the reference to fight back. I'm not about laying out a whole lot of stuff that I then can't demonstrate how I'll pay for. That would not be credible, and frankly, it would not be particularly smart. We will make announcements about better managing growth. They will be in these areas I've outlined today. There will be, I hope, people will view them as announcements that have integrity, announcements that have honesty. As I said, I am not going to stand up for the next 2 years and promise things I cannot deliver. You know, 3-word slogans, well, we're seeing the benefit of that. Go and ask any teacher what highest paid promises are worth 2 years later. Go and ask any nurse who got the bird what commitments to maintaining nurse-to-patient ratios are worth a year later. You know, go and ask someone stuck on the Westgate Bridge what talking about starting a road project at the other end, where you've got no sense of how it'll be paid for, other than a promise from Tony Abbott, who last time I looked had been elected to nothing yet, and his promise runs into the next term of Parliament. So I know I'm outlining for you things I perhaps won't do. Today was billed as an opportunity to give you a sense of the things that I think are important. I think I've done that. We, of course, will populate this with additional announcements, and managing growth will be an important part of that.
You've been rightly critical of Jeff Shaw over claims that he rorted his parliamentary entitlement for the use of a motor vehicle for business purposes, yet one of your own colleagues in the Federal Labor Party, Craig Thompson, is facing a series of claims that are potentially more serious, or at least as serious. How do you reconcile the two things?
Well, Josh, that's a good question, and let me be really clear about it. If people want to compare Jeff Shaw to Craig Thompson, that's fine by me. Fine by me. If you want to extend the important comparison, then you stumble across what is an inconvenient fact for the Premier, who has described Mr Shaw as, quote, a good local member, and then, even more bizarrely, has claimed that Mr Shaw has delivered, focus on that, delivered for the people of Frankston. He's delivered for the people of Frankston, the people of Albury, the people of Wagga, the people of Adelaide. You know, I've been everywhere, man, except in my electorate doing what I'm paid to do. So if people want to make comparisons between those two individuals, that's fine by me. But you do stumble across the fact that Mr Thompson is not a member of the Parliamentary Labor Party. He has been suspended from the Parliamentary Labor Party. Today, as I stand here, Jeff Shaw is a good local member according to Ted Baillieu. He's delivered, no one could question that, and he remains a member of the Parliamentary Liberal Party. Mr Baillieu says to every Victorian, his majority is more important to him than his integrity. And I think that is a very big statement to make to the people of Victoria just halfway through your term in office. I also want to make one further point. Let me assure you, nobody in this community is lining up for any more of the pious lectures on standards, on probity, on, you know, the highest of high standards in public office. We're not lining up for any of those from this Premier any longer. We're simply not. He ought to act on Jeff Shaw. That would be the right thing to do. Simple as that.
Mr Andrews, Leo D'Angelo Fisher from BRW magazine. Do you agree with the Prime Minister that sexism and misogyny are problems in public life and in the workplace generally? And on those fronts, how do you feel the Victorian Parliament fares?
Well, I'll deal with the end of your question first, Leo. I think that the absolute toxicity of the federal parliament is not something you see in our parliament every single day. We fight hard. It's not a timid environment, but I don't think we have seen the sort of toxic politics that have taken over in Canberra And whether you're a participant, an observer, even a neutral observer, they don't do any of us any great credit, really. In terms of the Prime Minister's comments, I think the Prime Minister hit it right on the head. She was not going to take a lecture on misogyny from Mr Abbott. I think Mr Abbott was unwise and perhaps gave Australians a really clear impression of him when he used that phrase and used it repeatedly during his speech. I think that was at best unfortunate and at worst much worse than that. In terms of the broader community, look, we know that there is sexism. We know that there is racism. We know that not all of us behave as we should at every single time. It's the job of a civilised community and a government, and I just take this point to hopefully to make my broader point. When it comes to things like racism, when it comes to things like multiculturalism, there is no difference in terms of principled support between Mr Baillieu and me. We often get up at events and follow each other and make the point publicly because it's important to say it, that when it comes to some of these things, there is no difference. They're outside the political contest. The fact that misogyny and sexism have been drawn into the political contest, I think that says a fair bit about how federal politics is being practiced, but I dare say it's also a commentary on elements in our community who could do well to behave very differently.
We have a group of students from Kilvington Grammar. I might invite one of them to ask a question.
Here's a tough question now.
Hi, I'm Helena Peartrack from Kilvington Grammar. Victoria is heavily reliant on coal-fired power to provide its energy needs. So if your government comes into office, what priority are you going to place on the adoption of more renewable and sustainable technologies such as wind and solar power?
Thank you. This is a great question, and isn't it important to get a question like that that's so much focused on the future from someone as young as you are? Thank you very much for that question and for being here and for the little tip-off you gave me about this question earlier on. I felt obliged to do that. I can't necessarily... See, I shouldn't have said that because that's now built up the answer. But anyway, I did get for a while to answer questions where I'd been given the answer beforehand. That ended a couple of years ago. But look, I'm not here necessarily today to make announcements about our approach to brown coal, our approach to renewable energy. What I can say, though, is that if you look at, and it picks up on the point I made earlier on in my remarks about leadership and about momentum and about drive, if you look at our time in office, we, in so many respects, led the way. And there was perhaps a bit of a political cost paid by us based on that. Wind, well, the wind is fundamentally compromised because of decisions of this government over the last 2 years. You know, I don't take the view that because a family member of mine loses a view from their beach house, you ought to destroy an industry. Others have a different approach. That's not my approach at all. It's about duty and responsibility well beyond your own personal views. You've got to be evidence-based, and the evidence is in. This is the future. This is the future. And to cripple that industry so that there will be no new wind projects, that is not leadership. In relation to solar, in relation to so many other forms of alternative energy, part of our problem at the moment is that there is no environment minister in this state. There's no climate change minister in this state. It's the Latrobe Valley or bust. And that's fine if you can go to bed at night pretending that the Latrobe, convincing yourself that the Latrobe Valley is the Pilbara and that we can export and that all these completely novel and unproven technologies and the billions of dollars of investment required to make these schemes work are actually real. I don't know about that. I've got my doubts about that. We'll have a policy around these issues, just as we did in government, and we'll look to play a leadership role, just as we did in government. I just want to... The final point I'd make, and not again to focus on the age of the person who asked the question, but it's become a bit popular in recent times to talk about climate change and environmentalism as kind of having had its day, it's waning, people are tired of it. I don't think that's necessarily wrong. But what I'm hopeful about is that young people and others, those who are not so young, will continue to be concerned about these issues of sustainability because they're not just about the climate, they're about our economy and they're about our future. Good question. I hope the answer is somewhere near that. And if you leave me your details, I'll be sure to mail to you our policy once we've got it out there for people to have a close look at.
Mr Andrews, Mike Smith from the Press Club. Thanks for outlining very clearly your 5 headlines, if you like, of your program. Now, I know you can't give us a policy speech or give us specific policy measures, but can you at least tell us your philosophy on the revenue side? What's your philosophy on, for instance, deficit budgeting? And what's your philosophy on where you think Victorians may be too highly taxed or undertaxed?
Well, I've never met anyone who thought they were undertaxed, and I've certainly never met anybody who would admit to the fact that they thought they were undertaxed. In terms of business taxes, business taxes firstly, and then go to broader kind of revenue generators. Profitability underpins growth, it underpins jobs. If you're not competitive, if you tax people out of making investment decisions here, then they'll make them somewhere else, and that doesn't benefit anybody. And you can look at our review of business taxation when we were in government, our cuts to payroll tax, our 6 cuts to work cover premiums, not just talking about reducing regulatory burden on business, but actually doing it. There's a long list of achievements that speak directly to our competitiveness, and I think there is a clear link between that approach, where it's not just words, it's actually doing things, and the fact that we're able to create so many new full-time jobs. In terms of deficit budgeting, we ran 11 surplus budgets. We left this government a surplus budget in their first year and surpluses forecast for each and every one of the out years. We ran AAA rated budgets. It'd be my intention in government to do exactly the same. Exactly the same. In terms of a broader philosophical question, having made those points about being competitive, we do have to realise though that families in my electorate, in my street, right across the country, right across the Victorian community, particularly in regional communities, country communities, are doing it very, very hard, and cost of living pressures are as big an issue today as they were 2 years ago. So there's 2 ways you can look at this. You can look, or 3 really. You can look at the sort of concessions we pay, you can look at the rates we charge, and you can look at the value that consumers and citizens get for those taxes, charges and the other imposts that are placed upon them. Those 3 areas, in a philosophical sense, you've always got to be looking at doing better in each of those. That's what good tax policy is about, that's what good value is about. Ultimately, it's what good government's about.
Daniel Allen Howe from the Herald Sun. The Victoria Police lodged what can only be described as an extraordinary and angry submission to the inquiry into the church's, plural, response to the abuse of children. And much of it relates to the time when the previous government was in power for so long. Why didn't you launch such an inquiry?
Alan, as a father who sends his kids to Catholic school, as someone who still considers themselves to be a Catholic, albeit one that I think receive a fair bit of criticism for some of the positions and decisions I've taken, you know, I really struggle with this. What's gone on is fundamentally wrong, and I haven't had a chance to read every single word of the Victoria Police submission, but it's shocking. It ought to make people angry. You know, I don't think this parliamentary inquiry is necessarily the best vehicle to have chosen, but I'm not criticising the Premier for having chosen it, and I'm big enough to tell you that it's not my proudest achievement to think that we didn't do this. I probably can't be any more honest than that. But issues of faith and values and, you know, how you pray to the God you pray to are very, very personal issues. And I'm not someone to run big, long lectures and talk about those issues. They're very much my issues. But I do look to my church and wonder a lot of things. and they make me angry and they make me sad. And there are many others who've got a much stronger case than me. But look, let's see how this plays out. And I've got to say to you, I hope the resources are there for this committee. I hope that the powers are there for this committee to do its job for victims, for families, for all of us. And I've got to say to you, I don't think politicians are the people to be dealing with this, but that's the decision the government's made. I commend them for acting on it, and I wish the committee well. Too many people are counting on them not to do this job well.
Ken Kogel now at Monash University, where I teach many public servants from other countries, and one of the things that I often hear is their distress at the way in which politicians in their home countries divert public resources for personal gain, for personal use. Here in Victoria, we've got the imminent functioning of IBAC, which on my assessment has actually been designed to fail. We've got the example in Australia of Queensland, where they learned from the Fitzgerald Royal Commission with many, many initiatives, including a very effective anti-corruption body and an integrity commissioner to advise members of parliament. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little more of your thinking on how to ensure that government in Victoria is not compromised by lack of integrity.
Thanks, Ken. I suppose the issue is, where do you start from? Do you begin this discussion with the premise of your argument being that there is widespread rorting and corruption going on across the Victorian public sector? That's not where I would start. I don't necessarily think that's the case. The question is, though, how much prevention is there in having the most robust mechanisms in place? And clearly there is, clearly. So it's as much about responding to the circumstances you confront today as it is about trying to shape rather than be a victim of those circumstances in a year or 5 years or 50 years. The IBAC, as it's called, where is the IBAC? This is July last year. If ever there was a triumph of hope over experience, a triumph of words over deeds, and now, of course, there's the issue that you allude to. It has, I don't want to be too dramatic in my language, but it has, you could argue, a fraction of the powers that it was supposed to have. So it's not here, it's late, and it ain't what was promised. Well, that's a triumph, isn't it? What a triumph that is. And this is from a government who would have us all believe, as we marched into the polling booths at the end of November 2010, that, every street corner had a corrupt public official on it. The corruption was insidious and everywhere, invasive, and needed to be dealt with only by a multi-million dollar vehicle. You want to talk about budgets? There's never been a corruption body like this that budget didn't grow. It's, at the end of the day, this will be a very significant cost, and as every Victorian knows, there's an opportunity cost for every public dollar you spend. You spend it here and you can't spend it somewhere else. It's as simple as that. So the Premier promised it. The Premier's got a mandate to do it. We haven't sought to frustrate that other than to hold him to the commitments he made. We haven't seen it yet. Hopefully it will occur soon. And I do concede that I might not share his view that there's the level of malfeasance or poor behaviour or corruption out there that he would have us believe, certainly in the run-up to the election he had us believe. But I do acknowledge that there is a preventative value as well in having the best and most robust gatekeepers or watchdogs in place.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more.
Or not? Yes. Oh, very good.
Daniel Grant Boyd from Bethany Community Support. Protecting our community's most vulnerable children is a fundamental marker of a civil society. Children in state care, children being referred through to our child protection services. Some of the outcomes for these children are really appalling. What would your plan as in government be to protect Victoria's most vulnerable children be?
Well, obviously, the Lewis Review and other work that's been done by the government is a positive step forward, and we've been clear about that. I think that we perhaps, well, and again, this is not an area where governments ought to be seeking high praise. It's about kids. It's not about politics or any political advantage. At least that's my view on it. But there was a long and significant list of investments and other policy reforms, from rewriting the Act, which was critically important, to better resourcing the child protection system and other related other support systems during our time in office. Whether it was enough, well, many have views on that. Whether what this government does will be deemed to be enough in years to come, without doubt, many will have views on that. I spoke earlier on in terms of service delivery and honesty. Now, these are not so much services as they are fundamental protections and the furtherance of the rights of each one of those kids to the life opportunities that they're entitled to. I think we do need to be frank about what can be achieved. We do need to try and take some of this away from the political contest and be just a bit more respectful that ultimately what we're talking about is lives and those life opportunities. Having said that, though, we should never concede failure in this. We should never vacate the space. We have to keep fighting and fighting and fighting, and there are things that can be done, often very simple things that don't necessarily cost a lot of money. With your indulgence, though, I will be only too happy to talk to you about not just child protection, but vulnerable children, and not just vulnerable children, vulnerable families and vulnerable communities. I mentioned fighting for fairness, and these patients, these clients, these people, these citizens are central in that fight. We'll make an announcement when we know how much money we've got that we can actually spend. Otherwise, you're really achieving very little. And when we do that, I'll be happy to answer your questions and others from what is a very dedicated sector, and no doubt the media will have questions as well.
One over here.
Hi, Dushka Sulicic from the Sunday Age. You said earlier that the Premier will have to come up with an infrastructure projects of his own because he's just cutting the ribbons that of the previous government's projects.
Yep.
I'm wondering though, how do you answer the criticism that many of the projects under Labor were mismanaged? I'm talking about Mikey and also the Auditor General's report that just came down and said there was something like $250 million over budget for a number of major projects that were started under Labor.
Well, don't be confused by simply the reporting of that Auditor General's report. The Auditor General's report found a large number of the projects listed were in fact begun, commissioned and opened by the previous government. The point is this: I'm happy to be honest about the fact that on something like Mikey, I am disappointed that we could not do better in delivering that project. But that also requires a bit of honesty in a broader sense, and that is the only way you avoid, that is put beyond doubt, scope creep, budget challenges, overruns, whatever you want to call it, or any of the other attendant risks when it comes to building something, is to not build anything. That's how you avoid, and that's what we've seen. We're not seeing any Auditor General's reports about this government's major projects, procurement or delivery performance, because they're not delivering any. It's a bit like talk about guidelines to inhibit unions, and that people might well get banned from major projects. Well, what an amazing claim to make and threat to make, a completely toothless thing on the basis that there are no major projects being delivered. So I'm happy to be honest, absolutely, and I've said right from the moment I got this job that we in many respects failed to keep pace with demand, with growth, not through a lack of trying, not through a lack of care. But you've got to be honest about that. On a project like Mikey, I am disappointed that we could not do better. But if we're going to have honesty, let's have a bit of honesty about the fact that the only way you avoid complex projects and all their attendant risk is if you don't build any. Now, that's not leadership. We all know that.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much yet again for your time and an excellent rundown of the way ahead for Labor at least. We look forward, I hope, to welcoming you back closer to the election.